Welcome to a presentation from the Academic Writing Program at the University of Maryland. I'm Linda McCree, Director of the Academic Writing Program, and today I'll be introducing stasis theory, a rhetorical concept that is one of the foundations of English 101 here at Maryland. In English 101, we emphasize the concept of inquiry, of asking questions to deepen your knowledge, as one of the habits of an academic mind. In academic writing, inquiry is a process that involves both the research that helps you develop an understanding of a topic and an attitude toward the ideas that you bring when you join an academic conversation. During your college career, when you are assigned writing for a paper or an exam, you may be responding to a given topic, or you may be asked to invent your own topic. In either case, being able to bring an attitude of inquiry to your work, being able to turn the topic into a question with exigence for an audience, will always help you to develop your response effectively. Asking a good question, one that is focused, clear, engaging, and exigent, is a skill that can be developed. In English 101, our tool for developing good questioning skills draws on stasis theory, a concept from classical rhetorical theory. In this presentation, I'll introduce you to stasis theory, provide a general overview, demonstrate how we might use stasis theory as a way to invent good questions and discover controversy in a topic, and then offer an example of analysis using stasis theory. So what is stasis theory? It's a set of questions or categories that can help determine what's at issue in a situation or controversy. We could say that it's a tool for understanding what's at issue. Stasis theory comes from legal theory, where it was and still is important to resolve what question is at issue before a case can be settled. For instance, as you no doubt know from watching television, police, and law shows, in a trial, the process and the outcome is very different when a death is ruled an accident rather than ruled a murder. So stasis theory is helpful both in inventing arguments and coming up with our own, and in analyzing what's happened in a situation. And broadly, we can say that stasis theory offers us an organized set of questions or categories for determining where disputes exist. So let's take a quick example from a criminal situation to understand stasis theory a little more. And this is kind of a silly situation just to help you get the idea. Suppose Bob has a bakery. Joe, customer, comes into the store and orders a loaf of bread. Bob gives it to him in a bag, and Joe pays. But just after Joe's turn to leave, Bob notices the bag with one loaf is still on the counter, and another bag with 2 loaves that Bob had put on the counter for a call-in order is gone. Bob sees that the bag Joe is walking out with looks bigger than carrying a single loaf. Bob yells out for Joe to stop, that he's a thief, and Joe stops. They argue about what happened, and the police come. The policeman has to figure out what exactly happened. He determines that yes, Joe is in possession of 2 loaves of bread, and Bob says that Joe didn't pay for the loaves. So Bob is claiming that it's stolen, while Joe says that he paid for 1 loaf and didn't realize he had 2. So what's at issue isn't whether the bread is gone or not, but how to describe what happened. And before the policeman can decide what to do next, whether Joe needs to be arrested for theft or this can just be explained in some other way, he needs to figure out that question of defining the situation. Was it theft, or was it a mistake, an honest mistake? So in any crime, the first thing that happens is deciding whether events happened or not, and then whether those events should be determined to be critical. Did they happen? Were they crimes? There's a lot more to say about the history and theory of stasis, and we'll explore some of that in future presentations. But for now, I want to focus a little more on what you can do with stasis theory. One of the most important elements of good research, of being a good participant in academic discourse, is being able to ask good questions. Now, we all know how to ask questions. At some point, you probably learned about the basic W questions of journalism. So we're going to see how those questions work and whether we need to add to those at all. Let's take a topic that may not seem particularly academic or scholarly. I'm going to use this topic of gossip. If you apply the W questions to the subject of gossip, you might come up with questions such as these. What is gossip? Who gossips? Why do people gossip? Where do people gossip? And when do people gossip? These are a great start, and there's academic interest in all of those if we stop to think about what kinds of academics might care, why we might care about those situations. But of course, there are more questions than just these. Could you try and invent some others? Well, maybe you came up with some of these. Does gossip hurt people? Is gossip good or bad? Should we really gossip? Do some people gossip more than others? How can we prevent gossip? And we could just keep trying to come up with questions just off the top of our head. But stasis theory is a heuristic, a tool that can help us understand what's at issue in a situation and what's being discussed in a text. In other words, it can be useful for invention and for analysis. And that's true of many of the rhetorical tools that you'll learn about in 101. So having a tool for generating questions can be really useful and practical in your writing and in your critical thinking. Before we can use stasis theory, we first need to understand the stasis theory as a set of categories. So let's look at our questions a different way. Here are all the questions we just came up with. If we think about it, if we look at these and think about them, we might start to recognize that there are similarities in our questions. From these similarities, we can make some categories. So for instance, we could say that these are really questions of how gossip exists. What's the very kind of foundation of it as a situation? While other questions are more about the causes and effects of gossip. Some questions, or at least one of them here, is a question of value. Is gossip a good thing or a bad thing? And then the last two seem to really be about the kinds of actions that we might take about this concept. Should we gossip? How can we prevent gossip? So what we've really done is just put these questions into categories that align with the categories of stasis theory. So what we've just done is put these questions into categories that align with the categories of stasis theory. Questions of conjecture, or we might call it existence and essence, include these. What's gossip? Who gossips? Where do people gossip? When do they gossip? Do some gossip more than others? The next category, cause and effect, included those questions of why do people gossip? Does gossip hurt other people? The category of value included the question, is gossip a good thing or a bad thing? And the category of action included those questions, should we gossip? How do we prevent gossip? So each of these stasis categories really asks a bigger set of questions. And here are the kinds of questions. Here are the categories, the 4 categories: existence and essence, cause and effect, value, and action. These are the stasis categories. And below we have the kinds of questions that each category asks. So questions of existence and essence are, does something exist? What exactly is it? How can we define it or describe it? Questions of cause and effect naturally ask about what was the cause, what are the effects. Questions of value ask whether something was valuable, good or bad. And questions of action generally ask, what should we do about a situation? So once we understand that these categories are kind of categories of questions, we can start using the questions of the stasis categories to generate even more questions. So let's consider those questions of cause and effect. We had some already, but let's see if we can generate more questions, including more specific questions. So we might ask things like, how did gossip evolve? The question of its cause. We could ask, does gossip protect us in some way? So if we're thinking about questions of what causes gossip or what affects gossip, we might also think about, well, do we use it as a defense mechanism? Is its cause that we needed to protect ourselves from something? And we can also think about its effects. What effects does it have on individuals or on a community? So from just this simple act of coming up with questions, we can start to recognize there are many potential research topics in this category. So from here, we can think about the kinds of academic disciplines that might be concerned with this question, with the subject of gossip, and how they might approach it differently. I'm sure you can stop to think and understand how different fields, anthropology, sociology, psychology, certainly even in literature or history, these different kinds of questions would have us thinking about different aspects and thinking in different ways, looking to different evidence. So a couple more things to know about stases. They exist in a hierarchy. That means that we need to agree with one to move on to the next. So not that one is more important than the others, not that action is the most important hierarchy, but that we really need to understand what's happened, that we need to have agreement earlier in the stasis before we can move on to a question later. Stasis means something's at a standstill. If we don't have agreement in one stasis, we can't move on to persuade people about arguments in the next stasis. So let's look at that question of hierarchy a little bit more. We'll use one of our questions from the question of cause and effect. Does gossip protect us in some way? So being able to engage that question and ask that question really depends on there being agreement in the earlier stasis of existence and essence. Right? So asking, does gossip protect us in some way, shows that we presume, we agree that gossip exists and that we agree about its definition. Similarly, if we're going to look at, if we want to think about a question of value, does gossip have value? We first need to agree about its causes and effects. So before we can really make an argument about value, we have to all agree about that question of effects, or cause rather. Does it protect us in some way? Well, yes, it helps. Gossip helps us know friend from foe. Therefore, it has value. And then finally, there's one more thing to consider about stasis, and that's the question of jurisdiction. Who decides, or who has the right to decide? You've heard the term jurisdiction in legal terms, of course. Which court has the right to decide something? Is a certain issue a matter for local, state, or federal law? Well, the question of jurisdiction really falls outside the hierarchy of the stasis, and it can apply to anyone. That is, we can ask the question, who decides? Which is the question of jurisdiction. And we can ask it about any of these categories. So we could ask, who decides whether gossip exists? Who decides what its effects are? Who would decide whether it's valuable or not? Who decides about what should be done about it? Now, of course, in some questions, the question of, or in some issues rather, the question of jurisdiction is not going to be particularly important. But in a lot of cases, in anything that would involve policy, certainly, the question of jurisdiction is very important. So from here, I'm going to switch gears and consider how stasis can be used to analyze a controversy, or more specifically, how it can be used to help us read and comprehend an argument. I'm going to use a few examples that are from English 101's textbook, Engagements with Rhetoric. So one of the readings in there is called Knowing Our History. It's a report that was written by students here at the University of Maryland in an upper-level history class a couple of years ago. We can really determine just from the title what the fundamental question, what's fundamentally at issue in this report. What do we know about our history? And the report itself does go on to say, well, what do we know about the role of African American slavery in building the campus? So we could say that really the fundamental point of knowing our history is this question of existence. What happened? In essence, how do we describe what happened? What was the role of African American slavery building campus? And how do we really describe that? Was it always a situation that we would term slavery? Let's take a look at another example that's also in Engagements with Rhetoric. This article, The Hurried Child, Myth versus Reality. In that article, family science professor Sandra Hofarth and a team talk about exactly what the title would suggest, the question of whether or not the contemporary American child is really a hurried child or not. So this is the opening paragraph of The Hurried Child, Myth versus Reality. We can see really from the title, just as we saw in the title of Knowing Our History, the question myth versus reality, really the question that's being engaged here is, does this situation exist? And we see this right away in the opening few sentences. With arguments of existence. They're saying this is what happens. This is the situation. Then they continue, the lifestyle in which parents spend their free time driving their children from a swim meet to gymnastics to a soccer match may not only cause adults stress, but also result in potential stress and strain for their children, a syndrome some have called the hurried child. So what we see here is in this second part, or the next few sentences of this paragraph, Hofarth and her team are saying, these are the effects. So the beginning of the paragraph stated, brought up a question of existence. This is what happens. The second part is, these are the effects, and there's an obvious implication here that these effects are bad, right? Stress and anxiety are things we don't, and certainly depression are things that we don't want to have. So there's an implication that these things are bad. And this is where Hofarth enters the conversation, and in fact, she's also saying, wait a minute, do we really know that these things happen? And so what the whole article is exactly as the title would suggest, that she's challenging whether this notion of a hurried child is a myth, Is it something that really exists, in other words, or is it reality? So the whole article really bases itself on a question of existence of a situation. Does this situation really exist?